I'm so appreciative for what CMDA has meant in my life. Hi there, my name is Whit Wilkerson. I'm a dentist in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I remember vividly about 14 years ago when my partner Pete Dawson and I had the desire to start a foundation to encourage dentists and dental students to share their faith in Jesus Christ with those in the workplace. At that time, we were able to meet with Dr. David Stevens, Dr. Gene Rudd, and through the support of the board of directors of CMDA, we were able to start a dental advisory council. And we've seen tremendous things happen over the last several years with student conferences, residency programs to encourage young dentists that may want to go on the mission field in their future, coming to the national conferences and hearing terrific godly speakers and meeting godly friends both in medicine and dentistry has been just a tremendous blessing to us. So thank you, CMDA. We appreciate you so much.
You're listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
Well, welcome back to CMDA Matters. I hope that you enjoyed a relaxing Memorial Day weekend and got to celebrate with me that summer is finally upon us. Here at CMDA, we are incredibly grateful. Your notes of encouragement and your generous response during our year-end giving campaign has been truly inspiring to me, friends. Thanks to the generous support of many, over the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've raised just over $580,000 toward our goal of $1.1 million by June 30th. We're getting closer, but obviously there's still some ground to cover. As a faith ministry, your CMDA depends upon the generosity of many to bring the hope and healing of Christ to the world. Ministries like Global Health Outreach, Campus and Community Ministries, our Center for Well-Being, as well as our advocacy ministry, they cannot have the impact that they are having without your financial partnership. When you give, friends, you are stepping in to inspire and transform lives for Jesus Christ. Please take a minute, if you would, to visit cmda.org/give to give your gift online, or the stewardship team, just call them 888-230-2637, or you can email them using stewardship@cmda.org. On this week's episode of CMDA Matters, I'm excited to welcome back two Dr. Jeffs. Dr. Jeff Barrows, he's our Senior Vice President of Bioethics and Public Policy and is my co-host. And the second is Dr. Jeff Hansen, a pediatric and adolescent clinical psychologist who joined us earlier this year, and we talked about his book called Transgender Dilemma in the Young. Well, Dr. Hansen hasn't let any grass grow under his feet. He's been busy since we last spoke with him back in January of this year because he's just released yet another book. This one is entitled Digital Enslavement Amidst the Search for Intimacy. It is a deep dive look at the effects of pornography on our society and our culture today. So saddle up, let's jump right into our conversation about a very sobering epidemic in America today. Today on CMDA Matters, I ask our Senior Vice President of Bioethics and Public Policy to join me because we're going to be talking about a subject that our Ethics Committee has developed a position statement for, and that position statement is entitled Pornography and Interactive Sexual Devices. And Jeff, just several months ago, we had our guest today on the program talking about a book he had written.
Yeah, that was on transgender. Today is on a very different topic, somewhat related, but one, as you know, Mike, that's been of interest to me because of my past work in fighting sex trafficking. So I'm looking forward to our time today.
And there's a relationship, I guess, between those two.
There is, unfortunately. It's two-way. Pornography leads people to buy sex, which feeds sex trafficking, and then, as we know, a lot of sex trafficking victims are caught and actually are involved in production of pornography. So it's two-way.
Well, Jeff, our guest today is another Jeff, Dr. Jeff Hansen, who's a pediatric and adolescent clinical psychologist. Got his training back in the day in PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arkansas. He's worked as a pediatric, adolescent, and adult psychologist in the U.S. Army for 10 years, and then in private practice for 25 years, and more recently at the Madigan Army Medical Center over the last 8 or 9 years. He's with the Center for Connected Living and clinical director of Holdfast Recovery. So Dr. Jeff Hansen, thanks for coming back and joining Dr. Barrows and myself on CMDA Matters.
It's a pleasure to be here, an absolute honor. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, only just a few months have passed since you gave us a heads up that you were working on a book that would come out, and now it's out, entitled Digital Enslavement Amidst the Search for Intimacy, dealing with the increasing plague of pornography. And early in the book, you document the staggering prevalence and ease of access to pornography. And, my impression is maybe a decade or 2 decades ago, a lot of public discussion, secular and religious audiences on the harms of pornography, but today maybe not as much. Why don't we hear about this, or are we mistaken about this perception?
Well, as we know, pornography has been around for a long, long time. And I think that what we're seeing with the advent of the iPhone and iPads and this phone and that phone, smartphones, et cetera, it's not so kind of an oxymoron, smartphones, because they really don't make us smarter, do they, in many respects? Yeah. But the accessibility to these things are just absolutely increasing. And the acceptance of that accessibility are increasing. It's difficult to pin down exactly why we're seeing such an increase, and it is increasing. Used to be maybe 7, 8 years ago, the first time of exposure for a child would be around 12. Then it went to 10, and more recently, it's their first exposure is around 8, which is absolutely shocking.
Incredible.
So I have to say, and this is going to be, probably will make a lot of people uncomfortable and a lot of parents uncomfortable. Part of the reason is a lot of the fathers in particular are doing pornography. And I've had this show up many times in my therapy. And if you're a father and you're doing pornography, how can you guide your child? Well, you can't authentically. So that's one thing. 35% now of women are doing pornography. So I'm seeing this in parents, and I've had women come forward in my mothers in my therapy who are battling, and one was a Christian woman. So parents need to look to themselves and their own habits. The other thing is the ongoing onslaught of neo-Marxism, classical Marxism, as we know, changed to neo-Marxism, march through the institutions, and queer theory, which is very, very active now in terms of promulgating really a bias against anything that's heteronormative and a push for pornography in libraries. We just did a town hall in Prescott here a while back, and it's even in relatively conservative parts of the country, a major issue. So I think there are many, many factors, and it's the culmination of all these things coming together. We've really, sadly, kind of lost our collective minds in terms of calling out evil, calling out sin as it is. And the only answer, pornography, in my view, many argue that it's okay in the bedroom for adults. I think the only answer is zero pornography. It is just so dangerous. And our children are losing their way, and they're losing their normal sexual development as a result.
Well, Jeff, you cited a few statistics there, and you have a lot more in this book. But as you really delve into the marked increase in both porn exposure as well as regular use among young people, and as you alluded to earlier, just both boys and girls, it isn't just boys. What impact is this having on our younger generation? I'm thinking now grade school, junior high, as they mature into adulthood and then eventually begin to seek a lifelong marital partner.
The impact is just egregious. And you mentioned junior high. Well, it's really more grade school. It's really more 4th and 5th grade, first exposure. And some kids actually younger. I've had children as young as 5 view pornography, and by age 11 were attempting rape. So it is alarming. There are many, many impacts, not the least of which is just you have an abnormal sexual trajectory through adolescence. And so the child brain, and even the adult brain, this is not good for the adult brain either. When you see this kind of imagery in this kind of way, it's shocking to the brain. It's actually even traumatic to the brain. And some will say that the early exposure to pornography was in a way actually a form of trauma. And I've heard this actually a bit more from girls. It's just so shocking. And so you develop aberrant sexual appetites. And we know this, that when a child gets into, and they go through the trajectory of adolescence, fed by porn, their porn habits embed so deeply in the very neuroplastic brain of the child and adolescent, because the brain, as we know, is much more neuroplastic, means it's much more changeable. And so if you take say an adolescent who starts pornography and ends up having erectile dysfunction or various sequelae, and then you compare that to an adult, the adult can come off and get their functioning back relatively quickly, the child much longer. And some of these early appetites, the early sexual appetites, you want them to be, or exposure to be healthy and lovely and beautiful. And when they're not, they tend to just basically wire in deeply into the brain, and they're not that changeable. So I have a young man that I'm seeing that's he's a young man now, but much older, and as he progressed, he developed some very aberrant sexual appetites, and he's now struggling as a Christian man to try to get over it. So in a way, Christianity is no protection, because even Christians are struggling. But we now are seeing increased aggression in sex. We're seeing sexual behavior. We're seeing increased depression, increased anxiety. Also, throughout development, an adolescent needs to have normal, I would say safe, encounters with the opposite sex. And as you do that, you develop confidence. Like the first time you hold a hand with a girl, or vice versa, or the first time you hug someone, that needs to be safe. It needs to be a slow progression. Well, these young people they don't know how to hold hands. They don't know how to ask someone for a date, but they know how to expose themselves to pornography and gratify themselves. And so they don't learn the necessary confidence skills. And so you see young men and young women who basically have no sense of how to comport themselves with the opposite sex. So they don't get into relationships, and they don't develop them the right way. And everything is just the sexual card first, and not aspects of a deeper relationship and what really forms safe, beautiful intimacy.
So, Jeff, a lot of science in your book, Digital Enslavement, and I know here in a minute we'll probably get to talking about some of the science there. In terms of the psychology, you spent a fair amount of time talking about shame and differentiating that from guilt. And Jeff and I had the privilege to interview just a few weeks ago Elizabeth Wanning, and she was explaining how the LGBTQ various identities, very different from one another, but what unifies them is shame. And so in your book, when you were talking about that, I thought about Elizabeth's comments, but you quoted Dr. Ted Roberts, who says, guilt is about what we have done, but shame is about who we are. I immediately thought of those different identities in the alphabet. With guilt, we can always get a fresh start. With shame, we are caught in a noose because the problem stays with us. So could you elaborate on how those two emotions, they play into sexual addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a rather profound question. And I do love Ted Roberts' work, Pure Desire Ministries, great ministry. And that distinction is one that I hadn't really thought of as carefully as he had articulated it, is about the behavior when you're have a problematic behavior and it's at that level, it's much more easy to deal with. We go to Jesus and we go, okay, I have this behavior, help me with this behavior. When we come to the conclusion that there's something fundamentally wrong with me, that sends a much different message to the psychology of the person, to the soul of the person, and also to the neurobiology of the person. And so we talk about shame being when it's that deep. Of course, we know as Christians, the only answer for that is Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so the only answer to true shame is Jesus Christ. And that is, psychology can take us so far, neuroscience can take us so far. And therapies are wonderful. I'm trained in some pretty good, what we call transformative change therapies. But if you're going to rely on a therapist to help, and it's gotten to the point where ultimately pornography doesn't start as something wrong with the person per se. It starts as something wrong with the behavior they're engaging in. And as pornography progresses, it starts to take a hold on you. Bad people don't get into pornography. But if you're in pornography too long, it changes you. It just changes you fundamentally. So then ultimately something is wrong with the soul. And that is neurotoxic. If you have unbridled shame, and it's not addressed, it can kill you. It starts to change the way cells divide. It affects you epigenetically in a much stronger way. It creates a neurocardiology flow and heart rate variability, changes that. It changes telomere lengths. It affects us in a very, very strong way. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to a traditional therapist and you don't have a Christian aspect of it, I'm not going to say you won't get out of pornography, but it's much more difficult because you have to address the wounds of the soul. So psychology is great. I'm a psychologist. I love psychology. I happen to think that much of psychology is not the best, but that 20% can save your life per se, but it can't save your soul. So the only way, in my view, to deal with toxic shame is through Jesus Christ.
Thank you.
That's much, and we must make that distinction. So we can address behavior, yes, through traditional therapies. We cannot address wounds of the soul. And I do devote a certain part of the book to the wounds of the soul, right? And I just think that, if I could write the whole book on that, that would probably be better, because that's really what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank goodness we have forgiveness in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jeff, you have brought up already trauma a little bit, and in the book you talk about what you term, well, it's not your term, it's out there, it's big T trauma and little t trauma. In fact, you kind of state that you're not very happy with those terms, but that's the reality. I saw those terms a lot when I was in the anti-trafficking realm. But there is a connection with pornography. So can you give us some examples of little t traumas and briefly describe how they lead to addiction, such as addiction to pornography later in life?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's go big T. So just so our listeners know what we're talking about. We're talking about big T's are, your house burns down, or you're raped, or someone in your family is murdered. That's a big trauma. That is very dangerous if it's not addressed. It can be very problematic. When we think of little t trauma, we're thinking more of, I'd say, more developmental, across the developmental, the early years. It can happen later as well, but wounds to the development are particularly pronounced early on. So little t traumas would be like not being affirmed for your feelings. And I don't mean to be overly, imbibing or overly catering to a child's feelings, but when you're led to believe like you don't matter, when you're canceled, you're not listened to, you're ignored, that's a small trauma, T trauma. Parents getting divorced could be a small T trauma. Emotional abuse can be a form of little t trauma. So these develop deeply in how, in particular, the default mode network develops. And that's that part of the brain when we're younger, we're just absorbing. We're like little vacuum cleaners. And especially below the age of 7 or 8, the brain's working on a little bit lower, predominantly like delta and theta brainwaves. So you just absorb things and you record them. And you don't have the capacity to judge what's happening to you. So it becomes part of just how you operate. We call it the default mode network. And we need that because we need to be able to kind of go on autopilot through life. So a lot of that early programming through small t trauma and also good things as well, I might add, become part of just how we just kind of go on autopilot through life. And if we have too many, of course, that just overwhelms the coping strategies of the mind or the brain. And so those negative default mode network behaviors start to play out. And if you are develop unhealthily, too much trauma, large T and small t, there's a lot of psychogenic pain there. And so you will tend to go to anything that can alleviate that pain. So that might be drugs, that might be gaming addiction, it might be pornography addiction, a host of behaviors to deal with the pain, because when we engage in that behavior, we run dopamine. Dopamine's a forward-acting, go get something in good balance. Dopamine's wonderful. But when dopamine's out of balance and you're using that to quell pain, then you start to override the dopaminergic circuits and you get down-regulating and escalating of the pornography or escalating whatever behavior you're using to defend. So no one likes pain per se. So we're actually wired to mitigate pain. And the brain is not the smartest. The mind is beautiful. The brain is a wonderful machine. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a wonderful thing, but it doesn't judge in itself whether things are good or bad. So it goes, okay, we're running dopamine, that must be good. So we're doing pornography, running dopamine, it gets it confused with a survival instinct or survival behavior. And so it overwires and it wires in. And that massive reduction in pain, and dopamine is problematic in two ways. One, or pornography is, and these behavioral addictions, because they offer tension reduction. So we call that negative reinforcement. When you're in psychological pain because of trauma or whatever reason, the brain goes, oh, well, we've reduced stress, negative reinforcement. We felt better. That must be a good thing. And then we're running dopamine. That must be a survival behavior. That must be a good thing. So it just wires it in. Unfortunately, there are consequences for that, because not the least of which, the brain goes, well, now we're running too much dopamine. We thought it was a survival behavior, but now we need to reduce the D2 receptors on the other side of the synapse, right? And so now we have a dopamine deficit, so you have to escalate the behavior. So pornography as a way of quelling psychological pain is particularly difficult, especially as we have it now so available on media, because when the brain downregulates dopamine, you need to have more. You start to go in withdrawal. It doesn't feel good. It feels very bad. So in essence, you're addicted in a way, probably using that term a little loosely, but you're addicted to your own dopamine, so to speak. I use that term loosely. But you will then go to the next level to get the same balance, the same flow of dopamine. You never get the high again as much. You're just trying to get the baseline. So pornography, because you can always escalate, there's no end to the perversion of what's out there. And so you are just caught in a vicious loop.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. We know that healthcare professionals and ministry leaders often find themselves on the front lines dealing with the complex landscape of addiction. That's why CMDA is partnering with the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary to host an upcoming virtual conference called The Convergence: Critical Conversations on Addiction. During this virtual event on September 19th through 21st, 2024, join us as we delve into the medical and spiritual dimensions of caring for those struggling with addiction, and as we craft a comprehensive approach to navigating addiction that incorporates both theology and healthcare. For more information and to register, visit cmda.org/events. Among all of our various ministries, CMDA's specialty sections give you the unique opportunity to equip, network, and fellowship with colleagues in your specific healthcare specialty. Organized by CMDA members, the sections include the Addiction Medicine section, the Coalition of Christian Nurse Practitioners, the Psychiatry section, and more. You can find the full list of sections at cmda.org/specialty sections. And if you don't see a section for your specialty, new sections are currently under development with CMDA's campus and community ministries. Contact CCM at cmda.org for more information about getting involved or starting a section. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
Well, Jeff, there's an incredible amount of neuroscience in your book, and I was intrigued by one of the tables that talk about dopamine changes for various sorts of addictions, and our listeners might be interested to know that the only thing that causes a higher peak than pornography is cocaine, and yet they're distinct in that pornography has a much more sustained level of dopamine, even more than cocaine, even more than sex itself. Fascinating. But in your chapter about the physical effects, you talk about 4 C's. Why don't you just briefly unpack those 4 C's, physical effects of pornography on the body?
First of all, let's realize that the 4 C's are just behavioral manifestations. And the behavioral manifestations of what's going on neurobiologically in the body. So we can explain, and I won't get that into this discussion, but we can explain these behavioral things that happen, or the behavioral descriptions of addiction, in terms of what the neurobiological substrate is. Things happening like dopamine flow, hyperfrontality, which is when the prefrontal cortex can't regulate what's happening. So the first one is craving and preoccupation. So the first C, craving. Dopamine gets us focused. It narrows focus on any forward-moving behavior. So when you're into the addiction pattern of any one substance, but in this case, a behavioral addiction, other things for moving forward, like going to work, achieving, getting that job promotion, all things that are driven by dopamine, begin to get filtered out because the brain's going, that's the only thing that matters. That's the only thing that matters. So it narrows focus. And then we lose control. So as you downregulate, you're running too much dopamine, you downregulate it, as I said earlier, well, you got to go to a next highest level. You have to get another hit. So you're starting to lose control. And then negative consequences, the third C. So bad things start to happen, but you're so caught up in this is a survival instinct, you don't really care. The other thing is that term I used, hyperfrontality, kind of a fancy term. It basically means that the brain regions, to be healthy, need to be talking to one another, right? So you have the limbic system, which is basically your instinctual, more emotion-driven kinds of things. And you have the amygdala, the hippocampus, and other regions that are very, very important for our survival. And so the drive for pleasure would be from that region of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, God has given us this amazing capacity of command and control. Above other species, it's amazing when it works. But as you're driving an addiction, your prefrontal cortex shuts off. You go more to your limbic brain. And your limbic brain is more your gas pedal, go for it, go for it. Your prefrontal cortex is braking system. So you can imagine how dangerous that is. So now you're all gas pedal and no brakes. And we also know this in adolescence. The rewiring that happens from age 12 to 13 to 25, the limbic system wires in first. It gets myelinated, so it gets much more efficient. Things that the brain feels don't need to be used that much get pruned out. The go system, the emotional system, wires in first, and later in adolescence and early adulthood, the prefrontal cortex wires in more solidly. So imagine this, you start pornography or any addiction in adolescence, the addiction shuts down that process. It slows it down. It slows it down to sometimes almost shuts it down depending upon how bad the addiction is. So you get an arrested developmental process where you get a gas pedal that's wired in. This is why one of the reasons why it's so dangerous to start pornography in childhood. And you don't get a prefrontal cortex to shut it down. You have a permanent hyperfrontality where the capacity to put the brakes on isn't there for you. And then finally, it's just compulsive. And some say the 3 C's, some say add that fourth one in. I like the fourth one because it's just basically, it's just driven. You're driven. And that's a dopamine problem, also a learning problem. There's some other things that happen. Glutamate happens in the brain. It kind of wires and it overlearns. It spills over and overlearns the behavior. So it's kind of complicated. Hopefully it makes sense.
Well, Jeff, we've taken a deep dive into brain anatomy, into neuropharmacology, and a few other things. But I'd like to pull us back a little bit and really ask you to describe then what are the resulting emotional harms, especially, I guess, both short-term and long-term for those that are dealing and maybe even recovering from an addiction to pornography?
In terms of development, you can imagine, we are so sexualized, and I can't help but go a little bit on my rants against the ideologies that we're seeing, that promoting sexuality, sexual matters so early in children. whether it's the transgender movement, that here I am at 4 and my sexuality and my gender identity is more important than anything and everything. So we're not teaching things like resilience, tolerance, patience. We're not teaching the virtues. I'm a big fan of the virtues. As Christians, we're all big fans of virtues. Aristotle was even big on the virtues way back in the day. But as we're over-sexualizing children through different ideologies, et cetera, and overexposing them, they're not getting those learnings that they need, and they're changing the way they grow through adolescence and their sexual appetites. They're changing in their capacity to be able to be resilient later on in life. And we see, as I alluded to earlier, also young men and women who don't know how to date, don't know how to be in safe, connected relationships and intimacy. They're more anxious than ever. So as we've overprotected our children in some ways and not allowed them to have risks in other ways, and not sufficiently paid attention to the things that we need to be paying attention to, like, what are you doing on that phone? They don't have the discipline to handle life later on.
Yeah.
We also are having increased rates of erectile dysfunction, which is very, very shocking for young men in particular. I've had a case or two where they are even contemplating suicide.
Wow. Because
they realize, well, here I am, a young man, something's wrong, and they're absolutely terrified. And they come to the wrong conclusions on that. So there are so many problematic outcomes that are far-reaching and will affect the person for the rest of their life. So we have, based on this experiment of being overly permissive some ways, and yet overly protective in other ways. It's an odd combination, isn't it? We're parenting, we're raising the most anxious generation ever. So we're putting the emphasis of watching over our children in the wrong areas. Jonathan Haidt talks about that so eloquently, and just came out of a book, The Anxious Generation, where he's trying to understand he's a social psychologist, trying to understand what's different about our children. So it's not any one thing, it's a culmination of things.
Yeah. Well, you've dealt now deeply about the harms of pornography, and as you know, we're recording this for an audience of Christian healthcare professionals. So many of these professionals will be seeing children, young adults, and adults who no doubt are struggling with pornography. So I want to ask, Jeff, are there any signs, I'm sure there are, that they should look for that might help identify patients or family members that are addicted to pornography?
One of the biggest is a change of connection. And you'll see, obviously, young people, when they're doing this, they know it's wrong. We instinctively know when we're off course. We call it the Holy Spirit, don't we? We instinctively know this. So we actually know it through the Holy Spirit, right? So they're off course, and they just all go into shame, as we talked about earlier, very dangerous emotion. So they're already concluding there's something wrong with them. And so they become very withdrawn. They might become irritable, not sleeping well, self-esteem goes down, a lot of the signs of depression. I just listened to a couple of interviews just last week as I was kind of thinking about this interview. And it was a young man who was just, I think, 11 when he got into pornography. And he talked about shutting off from people, not connecting, spending time in his room, isolation, right? Secrecy, irritability. And then he ultimately went suicidal. So we need to be talking to our children. As a healthcare professional, I would be asking, and I do in my therapy, whether you're a pediatrician or a family practice doc, et cetera, is, hey, how you doing with the pornography piece? And just bring it up. Are you seeing things on your phone that you shouldn't be seeing? Because we can help you with that. So I think we need to be asking those questions. I think parents need to be asking those questions. The other scary thing is sometimes you don't see things. Sometimes the child is able to mask it that well. And so many of my parents will say, well, not my child. And then in an interview, they tell me, oh, yes, I'm doing it. Because you have to realize that by the time they're getting in the later adolescence, 70, 80% are doing pornography, or actually seeing it. I'm not saying habitually, I'm not saying they're addicted, but they're viewing it or have seen it. So Whether you see signs or not see signs, it's important to talk to your children. It's important to educate your children. It's important to have safeguards on their electronic devices. I'm not a fan of children having smartphones. They're just too dangerous. So you can, if they want to fit in, give them a smartphone, but make it a dumb phone. Or give them a flip phone. I mean, we don't want to necessarily have our kids stand out too much, but we know as Christians, we do stand out. And so many parents are terrified to make a call or say something or limit their children. But we need to not be acting in fear, and we need to not have as the ostrich, the head in the sand.
Well, Dr. Jeff, at CMDA, we have produced a video teaching series with many, many modules entitled Faith Prescriptions. And so I'm very curious, and I want our listeners to hear from you, how you as a Christian PhD psychologist, how you integrate faith. Because in your book, you say faith is important to get away from this addiction to pornography. So how do you approach a patient with or without parents along in terms of integrating faith to escape an addiction to pornography?
I'm going to allude to this interview that I listened to the other day, a few days ago. And this young man was raised as a Christian, and his father was a pastor. And he blocked his phone. His phone somehow, some app, because he was viewing porn, locked his phone up. So he knew he had to go to his parents. He was like mortified. So he goes to his mother, and he spills everything. And the first thing she said, because he said, I think I'm a bad person. And she said so beautifully, you're not a bad person. I love you. You're not a bad person. You're not a bad boy. And I love you. And she gave him hope. And in those crucial moments, when your child comes to you or you find out, if you go into adding to the shame, you can lose them. I had one young man that was doing pornography. He put a gun to his head and he was looking everywhere. This was a military family. He couldn't find the rounds. I'll call him Frank. I said, Frank, if you found the rounds, would you pull the trigger? He said, yes. Would have pulled the trigger. So, and his father actually, parenthetically, was a porn addict. So the first thing is love your child. Don't accept the behavior, but love your child. And don't shame your child. And let them know you love them. Let them know that they're not bad. And let them know that you're going to help them get through it. Foundationally, the most important thing is connection. So I talk about Johan Hari. In fact, he just emailed me a while back, and I'm so honored because he's one of my heroes. He's actually not a Christian, but he gets a lot of things right in terms of depression and anxiety. And the hallmark of his book is connection. The book Lost Connections. And so first and foremost, you need to be connected. You need to be lovingly connected and soulfully connected and prayerfully connected. That is first. If I can only have one thing, it'd be acceptance and connection of that child, not of their behavior. After you have that, if you're going to take something away, you have to add something in. So these children are their life is so centered around media. And if you're going to pull that back or maybe go on a complete media break, cell phone break, computer break, etc., then you have to put things in. So connection to, obviously, as I said, good people, connection to good work, which means helping them do good things around the home, helping out, connection to the outdoors, connection to hope and that we're going to get through this. So the connection piece is just enormous. Then, of course, you have to move towards accountability. So if you're going to get back to some kind of media, you have to have covenant eyes or something where you're monitoring them. I would encourage you, if you're feeling lost as a family or as parents, you get them into good counseling. Now, I'm kind of a skeptic right now of mental health in general and my discipline in general, because we've lost our way as a mental health discipline. So you really have to vet your counselors, therapists very, very carefully and make sure that their values align with yours. And it's not enough that they just say that they're a Christian. You want to know, well, what is your belief in pornography? How do you handle this, that, and the other? We don't vet our therapists well enough. So accountability, connection, hope, and then if you have the good fortune to have faith in your family, then bring in faith and pray for your child. That is so important. Mm-hmm. But the way you pray, it can't be a prayer of condemnation. It needs to be a prayer of love. and that we're going to get through this, and Jesus is going to give us the way through this and the light that we're going to follow. My concern about many families, and even Christian families, is that we don't talk enough about values, about virtues, and I think we need to have more discussion of that earlier. One of the things I often do in therapy, whether I'm dealing with this kind of problem or others, is, hey, why don't you guys let's define your family values and teach your children that. Make a family coat of arms about what you believe in. And then when a child steps out of line, hey, which value do you think of our family, say the Hansen family in my case, you're violating? And how we can get you back on course? We're not spending enough time with our children because we're also busy. So that connection piece, I would say it's a family problem. And parents need to be looking at themselves, okay, how do we let this get so out of control? Why haven't we known what our children are up to? And not to get into a big condemnation, but look at that as correction. Having meals together. When you have 4 meals together, all the negative predictors go down. Just 4 meals together, the family meal. So we're living these fast pace, everybody's driving this way and that way, yet we're overprotecting children from risk, as I said earlier, because kids need risk, they need to be doing things and challenging themselves. So we're overprotecting there, but we're not overprotecting here. So sometimes we just need to kind of get some altitude and look at this as a family issue and how we address this as a family. And certainly if a mom or a dad's struggling, you can't help your child through this.
Well, certainly there's nobody listening today who is not going to understand the toll that this epidemic has had upon the church and our society in general. My family and other families in churches that I've attended, where I've served in ministry, have been hit hard, ravaged by pornography. I have been in conferences with other medical missionaries in quiet, confidential conversations, and I can tell you that a number of those sitting around the circle admitted struggles with pornography. And I've seen, even in debriefing, as a coming back from the field as a missionary with those who were helping us with debriefing, would talk about statistics, the number of pastors, missionaries, lay leaders within the church who struggle with this issue. We have an addiction medicine section at CMDA. Now, granted, one of their big focus is on the opioid epidemic, but other forms of addiction. Their key verse is one that I want to close with, is from John 10:10. The thief, our enemy, the devil, uses his tool of pornography to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus has come that we might have life and have it to the full, abundant life. And that's on the T-shirts that our section sold. And you said at the beginning that Jesus is our answer. His Nazareth manifesto, his declaration to the world, this is why I'm here. In Luke 4, he says to his hometown men and women, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, those enslaved, including those enslaved by digital media and pornography, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed.
Beautiful.
I want to thank you today, Jeff Hansen and Jeff Barrows, for joining us today on CMDA Matters. And we do have a message of hope. Our motto is bringing the hope and healing of Christ to the world, and our world has been ravaged by pornography. But there is hope, and thank you. Any final comments, Dr. Barrows?
Well, I just want to thank you, Jeff, for writing this book. As you said briefly, there is more and more people that are kind of normalizing pornography, that this is normal. This is part of what should be normal sexual development. But as you so graphically have described in this book, there's so many harms, and we need to keep reminding people these harms are real. It's getting worse. So thank you for putting this book together.
Absolutely my pleasure to be here, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
Well, you can find your copy of Dr. Jeff Hansen's new book entitled Digital Enslavement Amidst the Search for Intimacy on Amazon. For your convenience, we've also included a link in our show notes today. If you enjoyed this conversation and you'd like to hear more from Dr. Hansen, then I just want to encourage you to check out the interview that we did with him in January on his book about the transgender topic. Plus, you can visit his website, and you'll find a variety of other resources, including books, journal articles, and more. The links to his website and our first interview with him are included also in our show notes. I did want to point out that if and when you read Dr. Hansen's book, you'll find that he writes from a perspective on evolution that you may or may not agree with. But we believe Dr. Hansen's work and this new book on fighting pornography is extremely valuable to you, our listeners, and that is why we invited him on the program today. Next Thursday, I'm going to be joined on the podcast by Dr. David Levy. He's a neurosurgeon who articulates so well the vital intersection of medicine and faith in his book, Gray Matter, and in a couple of new episodes of our Faith Prescriptions on-demand video series. I invited Dr. Levy to join me for a conversation about the importance of praying with patience. So please join us to hear more next week. As I close this week, I want to share a testimony that we received from a CMDA medical student. And this student said, "My CMDA campus ministry has contributed to my relationship with God by being a consistent voice of truth in my life. It has been such a gift to me to be poured into by others who love the Lord and have walked through and are walking through medical school." Friends, CMDA continues to be a consistent voice of truth on campus, in legislative hallways, in practices around the country, on the mission field, and in so many more places. And we're able to be a consistent voice of truth here on the CMDA Matters podcast through our conversations like today's episode with Dr. Jeff Hansen. I want to thank you for continuing to listen to CMDA Matters, and thank you even more for your continued support of CMDA. With your support, we are able to be that consistent voice of truth for thousands of healthcare professionals and students through the ministry of CMDA. And in doing so, we are bringing the hope and healing of Christ to our world. That's what matters to CMDA, friends, and CMDA matters. We'll see you next week in the month of June, God willing.
Thanks for listening to CMDA Matters. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members, and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.